There's a story that's just come out, which I think is very interesting because it sort of sums up the deceit of Brexit almost entirely. The nostalgic mist is knocked from our eyes, and the stirring promises of Boris Johnson's Brexit, get it done, and then take back control of our borders, they all thundered. And now, in a quietly leaked Zoom confession, Chris Philp, the former immigration minister, the shadow Home Secretary, the current shadow Home Secretary, has effectively admitted, well, they didn't have a clue. Not only did the great British Brexit brain trust miscalculate the legal consequences of leaving the EU, they now confess that, brace yourself, we can no longer return asylum seekers to their first country of arrival in Europe. Why? Because we opted out of the Dublin III Protocol agreement, which they knew, or at least they should have known, it was all in the David Frost plan or not plan, or, as it's it's extraordinary because I have been saying this for a year, 2 years or something, and now suddenly a cabinet minister who was there, a former cabinet minister who was there, a member of the shadow cabinet, actually confesses precisely what I've been challenging, that Lord Frost was a twit and didn't do his job properly. And under the EU's Dublin system, the UK had a legal authority to return migrants to the first EU nation that they landed in, usually France, Spain, or Italy or Greece. It wasn't perfect, but it gave Britain some leverage in the tangled bureaucracy of asylum law. And then came Brexit, waving a little Union Jack and humming Rule Britannia, and out we tumbled from the Dublin arrangement with no replacement deal in sight. And Chris Philp has now conceded that they only checked out just before cutting ties on December the 31st, 2020, and discovered too late that roughly half of all Channel crossers had indeed claimed asylum elsewhere. And not only can we not return these people to their first port of entry, but we don't have the paperwork to prove that they entered via Greece or Italy or wherever. In other words, and then claimed asylum there and were rejected. In other words, the legal mechanism to send them back evaporated with our EU membership, and there was no plan B. So what was the government's dazzling solution? Rwanda. This illegal and absurd proposal, a country over 4,000 miles away, used as a threat rather than a practical solution. A plan that cost £700 million, deported precisely 0 people, and was struck down by the European Court of Human Rights and by the Supreme Court. And Philp now says Rwanda is necessary as a deterrent, but that's political euphemism for we're out of ideas and we didn't do our homework, we didn't do due diligence, because we were unbelievably stupid, because we were led by a man called Lord Frost, and by somebody who was so eager to get Brexit done that he didn't bother checking the details or reading the paperwork. Yvette Cooper, Labour's Yvette Cooper, with less flamboyance and more efficiency, points out that the current government has managed a 20% rise in migrant returns by, talking to the French, actual diplomacy rather than theatrical sovereignty, and rather than we couldn't be bothered to do our work. Will you do it for us? The tragedy here is not simply administrative incompetence, so there's a good deal of that. It's the audacity of the myth that was sold. Take back control implied power, strategy, and legal primacy. What Brexit delivered was precisely the opposite. A weakened negotiating position, devised by stupidity and laziness, severed legal frameworks, international agreements ditched without viable alternatives, and then, to cap it all, a Home Office that had been gradually wound down into indolence by Theresa May. The Tory response has either been denial or deflection thus far. They insist there was a plan, and perhaps there was, it just happened to be a dreadful one, rooted in ideological theatre rather than legal reality, an entire plan designed to mop up the mess left behind by Lord Frost. And this is the politics of post-truth. Perform the narrative, forget the consequences, try and hide the evidence. Chris Philp's remarks are such a relief. Though framed as technical clarification, they actually function as a confession. It's a slow unravelling of the Brexit fable, one Tory voice at a time, and as Reform UK lurks like Banquo's ghost at the Conservative feast, the party risks ceding both its credibility and its electoral base. Now, anyone who supports these twits who were in power at that time, the Suella Bravermans, the Chris Philps, and Boris, are supporting people who couldn't be bothered to do their homework. That is the fundamental problem. And the person in charge of that was Lord Frost. The lesson here that hubris costs money, £700 million for Rwanda, and far more in terms of public political capital and public trust. Philp may have spoken in a private Zoom call, but what he said will echo like a bell of reckoning across Whitehall. So, where do we go from here? Britain can't rejoin Dublin III without rejoining the EU, which for now remains politically unthinkable. The alternative is diplomacy, returns agreements with European partners, humane processing and international cooperation. But the question hangs heavily, will the Tories admit that Brexit, at least in this domain, was not a sovereign triumph but a logistical calamity? One suspects that until they do, we will remain adrift and the Conservative Party will remain in freefall, not so much taking back control as losing our grip on credibility.